Hi and welcome back to Bike Speeds. So this week we're going to restore, resurrect, service, rebuild, whatever you want to call it, this Voodoo mountain bike. As you can see from these before shots, this bike is in a very sorry state. It's going to have headset bearings, they were completely seized up. It's going to have bottom bracket bearings, new chain set, new chain, new cassette. We're going to be doing all the cables. The brakes weren't working at all when the bike came in. It had a puncture, it had a broken spoke, it had the full 9 yards of deterioration on this bike. This bike, as I understand it, was used on a paper round when the customer was a youth. It's then sat around for a period of time and he now wants to get back on this bike. As you can see here, initially the chain is stretched so far, the right hand side of that guide should be sitting on the right hand side of that link, and it's pulled so far through it's on the left. You can see here where the chain is slack on the chain set, the teeth on the chain set are pointed off. I'm surprised this wasn't skipping away when it was being ridden in its heyday with wear alone. So we're going to get this chain off, we're going to strip everything off, we're going to replace all the worn parts, and the brief for this was really to get this bike as nice as we possibly could with servicing, so that's what we're going to do. So you can see there the old chain was pretty rusty, so we get all the wheels off, we get this cassette off. The bottom teeth, you can see the rusty teeth at the bottom there, they were all very worn, so this bike probably was used in 1 or 2 gears on a paper round and had just worn off. This rear derailleur cable had that little kink in it, that would have stopped it changing gear nicely. There was also a bit of corrosion further up the cable inside the outer, so that had already run its last shift of the gears, so this wouldn't have changed gear very nicely. The derailleur itself, although it's very dry and a little bit of surface rust on there, that will clean up fine. We're going to put new jockey wheels on that along the way, and that will actually work and operate nicely. Same with the front one. You can see how dry this is and how it just needs to be cleaned up and re-lubricated. There wasn't actually a lot of wear on that. It probably didn't even get a lot of use in its day, so that's absolutely fine to put on. So we get the pedals off because we're going to actually get this chain set off. We're actually replacing the chain set entirely on this one, so we'll just get that off. We'll be putting a Shimano one back on there, and then we'll also check the bottom bracket bearings along the way. When I priced this bike, it was sort of a between range of prices that I gave the customer, because I wasn't sure what parts I would need to sort out along the way and what parts would need replacing or may not need replacing. And as you can hear here, this bearing is absolutely toast. Now, initially I'd said to the customer it may need a bottom bracket, it may not, but we had agreed that I would do those parts if needed, and as you can hear there, it needed doing. So out comes the bottom bracket as well, so we're getting this right back to the frame, which is a kind of nice stage to work on the bike anyway. So out comes the old bearing, we discard that. You can see there was some water sitting in there. There's actually a drain plug in that bottom bracket shell, and that was blocked, so we cleaned that up along the way. And then we take the brakes apart. This had no braking power whatsoever. I think one brake was just about gripping the disc and the other was not functioning in any way, shape or form. So we're going to also sort out the brakes, replace all the cables, so that this is really nice. So at this point we took the derailleur apart. I realised how badly worn the jockey wheels were. We text the customer to say yes, we'd be needing to do the bottom bracket, and yes, ideally we need to do the jockey wheels. So while we were actually cleaning these parts off, we were waiting for his reply. So we did actually clean up the old jockey wheels, because obviously we needed to get his authorization to do those parts. So we cleaned up everything, and then we got the text through to say yes, go ahead and replace the jockey wheels and the bottom bracket. So at this stage, although we cleaned the old wheels, we discarded those and put new ones in. It made sense. The guide and pulley wheel were both worn, and we needed to replace both of those, but one of them was more worn than the other, so we replaced those. So there's the new jockey wheels on the right hand side. We're just using a little bit of Loctite 222 on the threads of the cage just to hold everything together to make sure it doesn't come loose at any point in its working life. And then I also lubricate the thumb adjuster, because they're very prone to seizing, and a little bit of lubrication on there makes the world of difference to your adjustments along the way and your future servicing. And then we just use a nice thin oil on the pivot points. They almost don't need oiling, they're almost self-lubricating on Shimano, but it does make a difference to the actuation if you just dip a little bit of oil in there. Nice thin oil, and then we use the premium grease on the spring just to stop that going rusty and just to help its movement within itself. And then even things like the quick release skewer, and just lubricating that with our various greases, just so that again that will actuate and not stick inside the wheel and work nicely in terms of taking the wheel on and off. Next up, we had the headset bearings. We'd already agreed this with the customer, and when we took this apart they were in a very sorry state. You can see the bottom, how rusty that had all gone. But this had semi-integrated bearings, and I wanted to put fully integrated so as we could change the bearing race itself for future servicing without having a hassle and a problem, and make it a lot easier if ever they needed replacing. And also sealed bearings, as I'm going to put in here, just last so much longer than the semi-integrated. They're a real upgrade on what was in there. Often these bikes are produced to a retail price point, and some parts that you don't see so much will suffer according to the retail price. So you can see that on the right hand side, the semi-integrated original bearings, my new bearing cup with a fully integrated replaceable bearing. Just a nice little upgrade on this bike as we're doing it. So we're pressing in those new cups there, and then I shall put the forks back on, but I will clean them up first, get that surface rust off, just check the integrity of that steerer tube just to make sure that's absolutely fine. And actually on this sort of level, that's a heavy duty steering tube, so even though it had a little bit of surface discoloration there, that's absolutely fine to go back on the bike. So fresh grease for the bearings. That will also, especially in this bottom cup, it will just hold the bearing into the cup while I put the forks on. It just makes my job of refitting everything a little bit easier before we then put the handlebars back on. So we're just putting that together now, spacers back on, everything back originally as it was. We do these things finger tight initially just to check the adjustments. So you can see there the handlebars are now spinning much nicer. And then I'm just going to focus on the brakes. So we're putting fresh oil into both the front and rear brake, and we're also going to clean up the pads and get everything there operating nicely. So you can see here the old dirty oil, lots of bubbles coming through, and just generally you can see my new green oil coming through there. And what a difference, you know, you can just see from that alone that this is going to brake completely differently to the way it came into the shop. And for a start off, it's going to actually work. So we clean up after ourselves just to minimise the mess from the brake fluid, keep everything nice and clean. So a little wipe down with a microfiber towel, and next up I move my efforts to the pads. So I'm just cleaning those up now with a wire brush, and then I'll skim those on my machine just to give them a nice fresh braking surface to remove any debris that's on that surface. And you can see there in the before and after, the bottom pad is now ready to refit. It's still got sort of 2/3 of its wear, so plenty of wear on both those pads. They didn't need replacing yet, so they're ready to go, and that brake system now is already leagues away from where it was. Now with this front wheel, we had a broken spoke and a puncture. It was a thorn in the tyre which I took out, and you can see here we've got a broken spoke, snapped right off, and the nipple had dropped into the wheel, so we removed that. We'll put a new spoke on here, then we'll measure the wheel around its entirety to make sure the tensions are the same on all the spokes, just to make sure everything there is correct, and that hopefully then we will get no further problems with spokes breaking. Again, if this was used for paper round, it may have been bashed up and down a few curbs in its day, and that's just eventually caused fatigue to one of the spokes for it to have broken. But all the others felt okay to me. They were all adjusted. You can see here, this is our before graph of spokes that were either too loose or too tight. They're the ones with the asterisk, the red triangle, and then this is it as the wheel went out. So you can see we've now got everything within 10%, which is quite good for a wheel of this nature. Again, this is more of a visual representation, this graph here. You can see the broken spoke where it drops to the centre with no tension, and then this is how the wheel went out with a good tension both sides, both the disc side, drive side, non-drive side. So I'm happy with that wheel now. So I'll get this back together, line up the logo on the tyre, make sure that the tyre is rotating the correct way around, brand new inner tube in there, inflate it up to 3 or 4 bar depending on what the tyre says. This is absolutely ready to go back on the bike and is already beginning to look and feel an awful lot better. I will wash this wheel down before we put it on the bike, obviously, and you know, part of the detailing of the servicing also means that I can occasionally spot other issues, other problems, things like the bearings. I just check and feel, clean up the tyre, just make sure that the tyre wall itself is okay, and then just wipe round, and then I just turn my focus to the disc itself. These little score lines in here, you just get little lines. They are going to be one of the primary reasons for a brake system squealing. Doesn't matter whether it's on a bike of this nature or a high-end bike. If you've got squealing brakes, 90% of the time it's because of the disc. So I sand that around, and then I'm just using a little bit of wire wool just to clean up the arms of the disc, just to make sure it's all okay. And that's absolutely fine now, and it's much smoother and won't squeal, and will just give a better actuation to that braking system. So on goes our new cassette, which is, once you start to get to this stage where you're putting bits back on and new bits are going on the bike, you really begin to feel the sense of achievement of what you're doing and where you're going with the bike. And now we're just going to wash the bike down. This was just a service, it wasn't a full detailing. Use our detail brushes, just clean a few bits of surface rust off, like on the stanchions here. The forks on this bike were actually okay, they were operating as they should, so other than that little bit of surface rust where the bike had sat, they were absolutely fine. So we just clean that off and they'll be absolutely fine for its future life. A little bit of detailing with the brush there, nice firm nylon brush just to get any debris off. And then I just concentrated on that bottom bracket area, cleaning the threads to make sure the new bottom bracket would go in, drying everything off with a microfiber towel and making sure that's spot on before I start putting new threads into there. Clean up the rear triangle, always nice just to make sure everything's right. And then after we've done the sort of initial detailing with the brush, just give it a wash down with the big softy. This is a nice soft nylon brush, so as we don't scratch the paint. And then I use a brand new microfiber towel just to dry that bike off and really get that looking nice. This is a nice matte frame anyway, so it looked quite nice once it was washed down. A little bit of anti-seize grease inside the threads before we put the bottom bracket in. Now this is where the equipment you use is important. We've got a torque wrench there that does both left and right hand threads. There's a lot of left hand threads on a bike. You'll find them in the bottom bracket, on the pedals, occasionally on other components, left and right hand threads. So it's quite important with a bike to have a torque wrench that will do both left and right handed threads, and that's what we've got there. So I just torque everything up to spec, and then we've got our nice new Shimano chain set going on there, fresh bolts, a little bit of grease on those just to stop them seizing in the future. Again, certain parts I torque up along the way. In this case of the chain set, I torque that up as I go, because obviously I want that to all pull in tight so that when I adjust the gears, they're in the right spot. So those I torque up, but everything else I generally tend to just do pinch tight so as I can adjust everything, and then we'll run through the bike with a torque wrench at the end to make sure everything is correct spec. So on go the pedals, and then before we know it, this bike will be going back together. So on go the main components now, the derailleurs, front and rear, the hanger, which again I'll torque this as I go because I've got to put the wheel in. We don't want that wheel being in the way of that derailleur hanger, so I torque that one up along the way. And even the cables, we're using our super slick cables. These are tighter wound stainless steel cable. When you run your fingers along them, they're very, very smooth along your fingers, which means the gear shift itself is going to be smoother. They've got the same amount of strands in them as a normal stainless steel cable, but they're wound tighter, so they're much smoother, and they're slightly thinner, which means that they really shift and perform nicely. So we've got the super slick cables front and rear for both front and rear derailleurs, new outers onto that original derailleur, but with its new jockey wheels, so that is now performing like a new derailleur in itself. And then we start to put the brakes back on. I always put a little bit of anti-seize on the back of the pads. That's a little bit controversial. Some people say you shouldn't do that, but for me it just stops those pads sticking to the pistons and corroding any further than they already have, and will just give a nice smooth actuation to the braking, and will make the world of difference long term to the way that bike and brake performs. And also this little pivot point, I put a little slither of grease on there. We're not talking a lot, we're literally talking minuscule amounts, but it will make a world of difference to servicing further down the line. New chain and new cassette, new jockey wheels, new chain set. This bike is going to ride completely different. Well, you couldn't ride it when it came in because of the puncture, front wheel spoke and everything else, but this bike is going to perform like a new bike, and it will feel worlds apart from when it arrived. So we've got the new chain on there now, performing beautifully on those chain rings and changing gear as it should. Just up the brakes, just check that they're braking correctly as they should. And again, you can see they're absolutely performing perfectly. And now I'm just going to work my way through the bike with a torque wrench. Also things like this front reflector was actually dangling down when the bike arrived and it was tight, but I've loosened that, brought it back up to its correct position. Just little details like that just make the world of difference to the way the bike presents when it's finished. And then I just run through the bike with a torque wrench. So we do the front end first, middle triangle, which would be these parts that I'm now doing, and then I work to the rear triangle, which would be rear brakes, rear derailleur, and so on. So we just run our way through. we finish up with the derailleur mount. I've seen derailleurs actually work themselves completely loose before, so it's very important to do. And now I just check the frame components as well, and then I put a little bit of silicone grease on the stanchions just because they had corroded a little bit. It will just help them move in and out of the rubbers on the top there. And look at this, what a huge difference we've made to this bike. It's absolutely amazing. So well, you noticed we had a little spike in subscribers over Christmas, so if you're new to the channel and this is our first one of the new year, thanks for watching and thanks for subscribing over Christmas. If you're new to the channel, do subscribe now. Do drop a comment. We read all the comments and really enjoy that aspect of the channel, reading the comments. And do like, subscribe and do everything that you need to help us grow as a channel. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching and we'll see you again next week. Bye for now.